Hello, everybody, and welcome to Peaceful Anarchism on the Voluntary Virtues Network on theseedsofliberty.com and theconsciousresistance.com. Peaceful Anarchism is covered by the BIPCOT No-Gov license. This allows for reuse by anyone except for governments and the agents thereof. You can find out more information for that at bipcot.org. So today we have Jim Limber Davis coming in from Indiana, right?
Yep, Indiana.
Indiana. His main website is jimlimberdavis.com. His Facebook page is Liberty Defined. And he wrote 2 ebooks, Liberty Defined and Morality Defined. You can find him on Twitter at Jim Limber Davis, on Steemit under Jim Limber Davis. He keeps it consistent. And so today we're not going to talk about his books. We talked about his books in the past interviews. Today we're going to delve into the murky waters of a philosophical conversation. We're going to talk about self-ownership, basic definitions, and how it can be applied to practical life, everyday situations. Why is it relevant? Why do we need to talk about it? I certainly talk about it a lot, and so does he. So we may not see exactly eye to eye, but that's what these discussions are great for. We can iron these things out. So Jim, thanks a lot for coming back on the show.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad to help out.
Yeah, no problem. So, let's start off with self-ownership, a basic definition. So how would you define self-ownership? Somebody comes up to you, they never heard the liberty philosophy, and you mentioned self-ownership. How do you define it?
Well, if I'm going to define it in a way that people can understand, something that they can take away in the moment and actually apply that to their everyday life, I'm going to say, in essence, in a nutshell, and this is very crude way of putting it, and not very refined, it's going to be basically you homestead yourself. So long as you're refining your time, intellect, and labor to maintain your life and improve its quality, then you're in control and you own yourself. So in a nutshell, that's all it is.
Yeah, so I remember you mentioning how, talking about a child, said that, like, you define the child as being the property of the parents, but right. Most people would look down on that definition, like, what, parents own their children? No, it's not true. But you're like, and then the way you describe it, if I have it correct, you say over time the child, as they gain certain skills and independence, they gain more and more ownership over their lives until eventually they can become self-reliant, in which case they have full self-ownership. And, I wouldn't put it in those words, in those terms, but I would say pretty much the exact same thing, that we gain self-ownership slowly through the acquisition of various life skills and knowledge about the world. Being parents, the parents that we have, it's their duty, right, to protect us and to give us as much skills as possible, right? There's some skills they can't. You learn on your own or through experience or through reading books, things like that. And so, yeah, self-ownership, the way I would describe it, very basically put to, a layman, let's say on the street, would be that you are 100% responsible and accountable for your actions, right? So you cannot blame your actions on another person. Now, it's very interesting. Let me just explain a little bit of a recent example I had. I have a tough time with one family member. She's very emotional, and she got very angry at me, and she was even violent in the sense of breaking things, and then she wanted me to say sorry, right? But I wasn't getting violent, I wasn't getting emotional, and I wasn't getting angry. And I basically described self-ownership to her. I said, you have to understand that you are 100% responsible for your actions, just as I am 100% responsible for my actions, right? If somebody, let's say I go to a store and they say something that I didn't like, I don't have the right to destroy property, right? Like in the store, and then say that person offended me or insulted me with their words, right? So you are 100% responsible for your actions, right? So in the same way, you can never blame another person for the actions that you have committed, that you have taken, right? And one example with Walter Block, I remember listening to, where we say, like, if you take a gun and you kill someone, and they say, you're a murderer, you should go to jail, and then you say, no, I didn't kill him, the bullet killed him. But we understand that the gun is just a machine, right, an inanimate object,
Mhm.
and the whole reason that it shot was because we pulled the trigger. And why did we pull the trigger? Because our brain, our mind, told our body pull the trigger, right? So ultimately, in that case, we're always responsible for action. So I don't know if that's a long convoluted, but that's my answer.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. It still works with practical application that I put forward. Like I said, what I put forward is very crude because there's some other things that need to be understood. But everything I base self ownership on, everything I base liberty on, everything morality that I talk about is always going to be going back to those two books that I wrote. So what you relate, I think, still works very much so. I think the issue is going to be in getting into. So if I ask, what is the foundation of self-ownership, which I did a few weeks ago, and I put through a bunch of different social media groups, and I got a lot of answers. So just some of the answers I put through were, they asked me a rhetorical question. They said, what is the foundation of slavery? Well, it's the opposite. Or what is self-ownership? It's existing, or the same thing that morality is founded upon, property rights. Self-ownership is a property right, or you and you alone control your body. You have the greatest claim to it. All sorts of things. And then I started getting these answers about it's your soul, it's you think, and then a handful of people put in there, oh, it's about you having exclusive control over your own actions.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody posted something about Stefan Molyneux's UPV stuff in there. And anyway, so not a lot of people get it, and I think a lot of it is rooted in just not understanding what it is that is being asked. So I don't think people distinguish between knowing difference between self-ownership and knowing what, or let me rephrase that. People don't distinguish between knowing of self-ownership. Like, they might hear of the idea, but I don't think they really think about it and in terms of what it really is, where it's derived from, and how it's maintained. And I think that becomes a real problem with it. So what we presented, even what Stefan Molyneux presented, it still holds because it gives you some place to start working with. But if people don't go all the way into that, I don't think that they are going to really start to grasp that all of the other answers that I was given here, such as it's the foundation of property rights. But if I were to expand upon what I had stated earlier, self-ownership is going to be the first boundary of interaction with other individuals. Basically, self-ownership applies to people who can invoke these concepts, who can understand these concepts and what their purpose is. And of course, their purpose, self-ownership, is to set that boundary so that other people know where they need to stop interacting with you at. That way you can avoid unnecessary transgressions and things like that. So if it might be perfectly fine for me to go up and put my arms on my significant other, but it would probably be really weird if I came up and just put my hand on your butt. It might make you a little uncomfortable. So we have to set those boundaries, and self-ownership is the first one. And then when you understand self-ownership being all about controlling yourself in the philosophical sense, and then maintaining that control by refining your time, your intellect, and labor to produce the real wealth necessary to satisfy sustenance, shelter, security, and happiness, so long as you are the sole provider for that, taking absolute responsibility, like you were saying, then it ends up being, you can translate that into a further concept, getting into morality and the non-aggression principle and a further boundary. So that's where I would have taken it if I were to have written a book just on self-ownership alone.
All right. I I had a debate with this guy, Todd Lewis. I don't know if you heard it. He's a Christian distributist, he described himself as, and I didn't really know what that was before I talked to him. But one of the things that he had issue with regarding self-ownership was, he says all these libertarians and anarcho-capitalists or anarchists say that they own themselves. And he's like, that's impossible, because ownership is, if you own a chair, you're not the chair, you own the chair, and you can break the chair, you can give it away, you can do whatever you want with it, but you're not the chair. And so if you say you own your body, how do you separate the mind from the body? And I thought that was an interesting semantical type argument. It didn't really put much any doubts. I mean, and I just said, maybe it's a different type of ownership, but to me, it's the same. Actually, it is kind of, now that I think about it, without the mind, the body is just really a shell, inanimate object shell, right? It's really the conscious mind that gives it animation and life, right? So in a sense, I guess you could say we are like a chair, and so. But still, still, I still maintain self ownership. I still think it's a valid concept, and from which property rights and voluntarism stems from. So, and that's the real foundation for the entire philosophy in the way I look at it.
I've heard that before. The argument or the idea anyway, about separating mind from body. And maybe we are just like the chair, because if we're refining our time, our intellect, and our labor to go in and gather the wood pieces in order to shape them and to create a chair, we're refining our time, intellect, and labor to create something of real wealth, something that satisfies our desire for sustenance, shelter, security, or happiness, or enables greater pinnacles of our successes in achieving those things. So maybe it is just the mind that's claiming ownership over the body, because without the body, the mind has no vessel to travel in. I don't know. Right. I have no idea. I'm not into the spiritual stuff. I mean, I celebrate Yuletide instead of Christmas. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if anybody wants to invoke the spiritual stuff, they're more than welcome to, but I try to steer away from that, because it's very difficult to prove or disprove something, or to use something that you can't prove or disprove exists or doesn't exist. And it's almost like it's a trap. I think, intellectually speaking, I'd rather stay away from that. But I think it would be fair to say that if we take care of our bodies, then okay, we are like the chair.
Yeah, isn't that, when you said you can't disprove something, it's not falsifiable. I believe that's the term for that, where it's like if you tell somebody you have an invisible spider's on your head, and you say, where? You say, we can't see it. And you go to touch it. Well, you can't touch it either. And you say, well, I don't smell anything. You can't smell it either. How do you know it's there?
Right.
So isn't that what's called? It lacks falsifiability.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. Something, it's like a statement or something that's an inherent possibility, but you can't really prove it. Like you could say there's absolutely no pink and green unicorns or whatever in the world or in the universe,
Right.
But unless you go to every single star system and turn over every single rock,
right.
It's really, I don't know, maybe something like that. I don't know. I don't like invoking those sorts of things there. I rather be able to show a clear, transparent path of thought progression, starting with the goal. So if you're going to invoke something, a concept in which it's going to be used to interact with other people or justify punishing other people, then the concept has to be clear. The goal has to be absolutely clear. Everything has to be universally applicable to everybody else. And I think with what we described as self-ownership to start with, I think that's universally applicable for everybody. So it'd be easy to say, okay, look, I own myself, you own yourself. These, unless we're changing the way we're going to interact with one another, okay. But to say that self-ownership just exists because some mystical being says it does, I don't know. I want to know why it does. I don't want to just accept it for what it is. And that's something that really gets to me, where a lot of people will say things like, it's self-ownership is axiomatic, it's self-evident, or it's just inherent. And then I ask them, I say, okay, well, why is it axiomatic and inherent and self-evident? And then I go and I'll look these words up, and okay, axiomatic, it means, according to dictionary.com, it'll say something like it's inherent or it's self-evident. Oh, okay, well, what do those words mean? It just exists because it exists in there, or it doesn't need proof of being in existence. All you have to do is look and you can see the proof. But if we all owned ourselves and all we had to do is look, and it's that obvious, well, then why is there government ruling over everybody else if it was that obvious? And I don't like I don't like that approach too much, where people get into that, and then they end up invoking the spiritual stuff. I have no problem if people want to invoke that stuff for their own thing, so long as it doesn't interfere in my life, negatively or positively. And that's the killer. I'll tell people that, and they'll just, "What do you mean, or positively? I thought you want good stuff to happen." Yeah, I do. But if the good stuff happens into my life because somebody invoked something that can't be proven or disproven, then that gives them wiggle room, the grounds to invoke something that I don't want to have happen in my life. So I'd rather not go that route at all with explaining something that I think should be universally applicable to everybody. And we were talking before we started the recording about the character that I have on my profile a lot of times. Well, that's Tom Baker, the Fourth Doctor, and one of my favorite things that was said in an episode was that he says, "To the rational mind, nothing is inexplicable, only unexplained." And I have never forgotten that. I keep that around. So when I ask these people if something is, why is it axiomatic? Why is it inherent? Why is it self-evident? Why is it any of these things? Most of the time, people they either get mad and tell me to expletive off, or they go read a book, or they'll cite natural law, and then it's something that can't be proven, which is something that I'll get into on my own channels and pages about breaking that down. But yeah, no, having a clear goal, a transparent path of thought progression from the goal all the way to the means makes everything so much easier. I think that way, if you know what the goal is, then you can set parameters to invoke, in which case you can use those parameters to define your means. And if your means violate or don't work within the parameters that you create and end up being inconsistent with the goal, then you know what you have to do. You have to change the means. But if you don't have that clear foundation of what self-ownership is, then which then I will argue leads to the creation and enactment of morality, the non-aggression principle being the neutral base of that, leading to non-aggression as your neutral base, morality as your positive, and immorality as your negative, then you can't create a clearly defined set of parameters and means in order to employ. And then everybody starts doing all sorts of crazy stuff, like invoking a social contract, and then they start invoking government, and then everybody's in everybody's spaces, and then it's just hostility all around, and that's terrible.
You remind me of a common scenario that people give to me when I talk about self-ownership and the possibility of a voluntary society, and they say, well, so you say everyone has self-ownership and everyone's 100% accountable and responsible for their lives. Well, what if a crazy person, like somebody who is obviously doesn't have control over their body, and they do some horrible things, they rob people, they kill people, what do you do with them? How do you treat them like a person that has 100% control? Do you punish them in the same way that if a regular person did those acts? And I'd like to tell people that these concepts are just that. They're concepts, they're principles, they're guidelines for life, and I think they're not intended to give a clear-cut black and white answer to every single possible human situation that we can find ourselves in. And it's kind of funny that statists often require that we do give them every single possible detail of how it would work, and yet so much of the reality goes, they're ignorant of so much of what goes on today. But they want to know, how would a voluntary society deal with somebody like that? And sometimes, I can give them my answer, but sometimes I like to say, you know what? I don't know. Let's figure it out. Maybe every situation is different. There's every crazy person. There's a different situation, different group of people. They react differently. They come up with their own solution. That's not a reason to support a monopoly on arbitration, right? And courts, right? Clearly not. So yeah. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts on that.
I'm actually really excited you brought that up. I'll spare you all the details of all the things that I screamed at the wall in the shower while thinking about this earlier today. No, okay, so do you like watching television shows?
Me.
You ever watch any television shows? Have
I mean, I
anything like that?
have, but not lately.
Do you read? Do you read science fiction or fiction at all?
No, I'm not. I do not like fiction. I'm more of a, a philosophy,
Okay, we're done.
economics.
I'm out. I'm out. We're done. You don't read. That's one to the heart right there. That's one to the heart. I'm
to,
going.
to me, the saying "reality is stranger than fiction." Like, I would rather spend the limited time and resources I have alive, knowing or trying to figure out, these kinds of things in reality than descend into the imagination of a person. But that's just me.
Well, that's the
That's
great
just
part,
me.
though, because if you think about it, all of the stuff that's been science fiction once upon a time is now science reality.
Right,
And
right.
so, getting back to your question, so my partner and I, we've been watching Supernatural. We like to binge watch shows on various platforms, and
Mhm,
the most recent one we're watching is Supernatural.
mhm,
And so it actually plays right into your question because a lot of the shows revolve around demonic possessions, where a demon
mhm,
takes over an individual. So again, so you can see maybe where this is going, where the individual is no longer in control of their actions. But the moment the two main characters figure out what's going on, they have the good hunter, they have the bad hunter scenario. The good hunter being the younger brother, he's more compassionate. No, there's a person in there. We need to free the person. Once they realize that's what's going on, that's what they do. They free the person, and it doesn't matter whether it's a demonic possession or if it's some sort of virus or disease, like in the most recent episode we just watched, where there was this werewolf issue where it was causing the person in question to not be able to control their actions, and so they tried all sorts of other things. But it's going to be dependent on the context of the situation. So even if just because and what was that? There was I think it was Arthur C. Clarke or somebody said something about magic is just science we don't understand yet, or something like that. And I think
yeah.
that a lot of people forget that there's always a reason. And just like with the doctor, to the rational mind, nothing is inexplicable, only unexplained.
Mhm,
It's just a matter of getting the context of the information together
mhm,
and being able to think as quickly as possible, define concepts, understand, process information being given to you, and then to work from there. Because the way I set up my moral philosophy and morality defined, if you've read that, if people listening have read that, they'll know that it's applicable to all reason capable sentient beings able to communicate at least complex concepts with one another, at least complex enough to understand the setting of boundaries for the purpose of the preservation of one another's lives. And that's something that if we take that into consideration, then we can break down all context. We can figure out a way of helping people and protecting and saving them, or whatever it is that we need to do with them. But we can do that right now. Take your question, alter it a little bit, and then we can get into that brings up the question of, well, what do we do about comatose people?
mhm,
Do they still own themselves?
mhm. Right.
Well, it depends on a lot of things. Do they have loved ones who are willing to take care of them?
Mm,
Did they set themselves up financially so that they sign contracts? Did they have health insurance that did X, Y, or Z to provide for them? There's all sorts of things that people can do to maintain control over their self ownership. Because what's going to happen is once they've set all these things in motion, and something happens to them, and they can no longer physically care for themselves like they were before. So, like if they were able to set up a fat bank account, now they have the money to be able to pay for everything that they need, and they can still maintain themselves because they took all of their time, intellect, and labor before whatever happened to put them in a state of a comatose state, or means that they couldn't provide for themselves as like they used to where now they have everything and saved. They took all that wealth, turned it into stores of labor, money, or currency, and now have that. And that's what's going to keep them okay. So, but yeah, to answer your question, it's just about understanding the context, finding out what's going on.
Yeah. So these very sticky and obscure scenarios, they don't invalidate the principles, right? They just, because again, the principles are just guidelines, right? It's not a substitute for thinking. It's not like a manual. You look at
I don't know if they're
page.
principles, but I mean guidelines. I don't know if they would be guidelines per se, but okay. I mean, I see where you're going with it though.
Yeah. Like, it's actually the same way I describe parenting and peaceful parenting. I say, I'm not telling you how to parent. I'm just giving you these principles that I live by and that I think they're consistent, and logical and moral, and you can choose to abide by them or not. And also they're not a manual, like every parent wants a manual. Like, what do I do if my child does X? Turn to page 53,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to say what you should do. And that's kind of, and also the same thing with voluntarism. I think it's more I think it's a descriptive philosophy, not a prescriptive philosophy, right? So it describes reality, but it doesn't tell you how to act, right? It doesn't tell you, you can still be a pretty mean person and live according to voluntarist principles. Live your whole life not aggressive against somebody, but you can still be a pretty mean person. So it's not to say that you're a really nice person. It's just to say that you're not aggressing against somebody, if you're abiding by these principles. So they're very basic. It's a skeleton way of thinking about the world that most people have not thought about, because we have lived so long with this poisonous idea of the state, that these people have this exemption to morality that we all are subject to. So yeah, so that's kind of the way I describe voluntarism. It's not a manual of how to act, how to live your life. We're not telling you how to live. We're just saying, don't do these things. Very basic things.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. That makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, yeah, it's not a manual. That I definitely agree with. I don't think. I wouldn't say it's I wouldn't call it as loose as something as guidelines would come across, but I do understand the point. It makes sense because we all have a canvas to paint on. We all get a canvas. Some of us get a bigger canvas than others, depending on whatever genetic codes dealt us certain hands to play with or whatever. But how we paint that canvas is the difference. But you said something about people being mean and still living by the voluntary philosophy, and that's interesting. So that came up, that comes up a lot with people, and it's a very either or scenario, I think, where people start talking about this, and then they get into this. Well, if you're not doing this, then you're immoral, or if you're not doing that, or if you're doing this, then you're moral, but if you're doing that, you're immoral. And a lot of people take things to be mean or immoral when they're not really mean or immoral, they're just amoral.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's very difficult to get people out of that mindset. I mean, everybody struggles with this because it's having to deprogram yourself from what you were taught as a kid. Unless you were lucky and you were one of Danilo's kids, you're not going to be, or my daughter, but she's 12 and sassy. So, but in order to break that programming, it's very difficult, and a lot of people get stuck in this either or concept, and that's the thing with the non-aggression principle. A lot of people start, well, how do you handle this? How do you handle that? I have this trouble with my partner sometimes, where she gets into the mindset of, well, we've got to do something about it. We got to save these people. We can't. And I tell her it's a really crappy world sometimes because people don't make the time to do what is absolutely necessary before they start with the hostilities. They don't make the time to sit down and talk and hash out ideas. They don't want to be bothered with that. So then hostility ends up being the answer. So people never realize that the non-aggression principle is your neutral foundation of all morality, at least as I lay it out in my philosophy. And then anything that protects life but not necessarily promotes it ends up falling under the non-aggression, the neutral foundation there. And then comes all the bad stuff. So if you do something that intentionally is meant to hurt life, at least the life that this code is supposed to be applicable to, then it's immoral. But if you do anything to promote it, it's moral. And then you have morality is what all of these concepts are, but then you have it's moral, positive, then non-aggression, neutral, and then immoral is the negative. And I think a lot of people miss that middle point there, and everything ends up being that either or scenario, which is really difficult, especially when going all the way back to the self ownership. People are just, well, then somebody should help me pay my bills, or somebody should help me fend me off from these wolves, or somebody should help stop this robber. No, if you're gonna make somebody responsible for that, then you basically enslave them to helping other people. Society with that moral code then is enslaved to itself, because now they have to take care of everybody. And I don't think people have looked at that enough. I just don't think people have taken enough time for that. And then you brought up the owning your children, and this plays right into that, where how many resources does it take to raise a child? Lots of resources. So the child absolutely needs to be recognized as property of the parent, because mom and dad refined their time, intellect, and labor making the beast with two backs, somewhere, whether it was in the back of their car or in a cheap motel. They did that and brought us into the world. Then they were kind enough, in order to invest their time, intellect, and labor, to provide for us, to give us all these resources. Because I would argue, up until we're about possibly 4 to 8 years old, where most of us are going to be absolutely dependent on someone to take care of us. We can't do anything. Now, I say 4 to 8 years old because most of us, unless this was, say, 150 years ago out on a farm in the Midwest somewhere, or wherever in the world, where 5-year-olds, they were up at 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning with mom and dad out there taking care of chickens and cows and stuff like that. And then the older they got, it depends on how you work with your kids, I think, and teach them these skills. But they're always going to be dependent on you up until a certain point, and then they'll take over providing for themselves. So I don't know. There's a lot of stuff to talk about pertaining to this, and it's probably too much for a single hour, I think.
Yeah, probably. But one thing you did remind me of is a recent conversation with a family member who does listen to occasionally my interviews and and read my articles, and she said, Danilo, all you talk about is philosophy and theoretical stuff and morality.
Oh, you're so boring. Oh.
and she was saying this because, she was asking what I thought about Trump and what's going on in the current events. I don't know, Hillary Clinton and her email scandal and all that. And I say I focus on, I focus on these things: philosophy, morality, economics. And she's like, but those are just theoretical. They're out there. They're in the abyss. They're ephemeral. This is reality. We live in reality. And I said, yeah, exactly. And what's your philosophical basis? How do you operate? How do you act? We all have a basis, a moral basis, a philosophical basis that we act upon. And that's what I'm curious about, because you're not going to change reality by just talking about reality. You change it by changing people's paradigms, the way they think, right? Their principles by which they live. That's the crux of it. That's the core, right? You just focus on what's happening in reality, and it's like you're just trimming the branches of the problem. And who was it? Eleanor Roosevelt said, she says, when people talk about current events and great minds talk about, what is it? I forget.
Common people talk about other people.
Right.
More wiser minds talk about ideas and concepts, or something like that.
Something like that. Right. Yeah. So this is why I do focus on this stuff. I think it's paramount. If you don't understand, you have all these problems in your life, and you're like, why do I have all these problems? All right, let's figure out, what is your morality? What are your principles? What do you live by? What do you feel passionate about? That's what I want to know. That's what's important to me.
Maybe these people just want to have their lives be like a special victims unit episode, where it's like, well, we got to figure out why he did this. Well, there's my moral code. This is exactly why I did it. Yeah. Problem solved.
Yeah.
You know everything. I mean, that would make for a very, very boring case of Law and Order, but
Right. So we're I think what you and I are doing, what a lot of other people in the liberty movement like Sterling Lujan are doing, are really out to figuratively attack the root of the problem, right? Which is the philosophical and moral foundation that many
Yes.
people live by. And one other thing that you reminded me of when you talk about amoral actions is the thought experiment of if you're walking past a lake and you see somebody drowning and you keep going, is that an immoral act, right? And I think most people would say, yes, that's an immoral act, right? And we would say, no, that's amoral. You don't have any obligation to act, right? Or if you see somebody being mugged, do you have an obligation to intervene? Not necessarily, right? You're not being immoral. You are being kind of, let's say you have time in the day and you could do something. You are being a kind of a jerk if you don't try to help, but you're not really being an immoral person, being that you could be punished,
Right.
immorality being theft, assault, rape, and murder. You could be punished for walking by. No, that would be ridiculous.
Yeah, well, I lay that case out. The same scenario, just in my book, I lay it out, but I do it with a stranded motorist on the side of the road instead of someone drowning. Less dramatic, but okay, we'll go with the dramatic part. So if honestly, if I were to stop and jump into the lake, is it really going to be, oh my God, thank you, you saved me, or is it going to be like Will Smith's Hancock movie where it's like, ma'am, is it okay? May I touch you to get you out of harm's way? Like, you don't know. I mean, you
Right.
don't have time to talk to these people. Of course, in the moment, the person's probably gonna be like, oh my God, save me.
Yeah.
But what do I get in return for spending and refining my time, my intellect, and my labor to swim out into this lake? What if it's 3 miles out?
Mm.
Hey,
Right.
what if it's just a few feet out? What do I get? This person would be indebted to me for whatever we agree upon.
Mm-hmm.
But most people would say, no, you sick expletive, you don't get anything. It's your moral obligation. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. You just enslaved me to go around being a superhero.
Right.
Now, if that's the case, then by that logic, law enforcement should do this without getting paid. I'm just saying,
Exactly.
if their job is to serve and protect the common people, then they should do that without getting paid. So where's the clarity of the goal needing to be achieved? Where's the parameters set in order to which to derive a means in order to achieve that goal? Where is that?
Mhm.
And this is it's crazy that people don't understand this. So I've been a trainer and a teacher for a long time. I've been teaching stuff since I was 16 and 17 years old. Various things, everything from simple martial arts when I was younger, all the way to kitchen management and training, and now with the warehouse job that I have. One of the things I bring up to people, I ask them, I say, "Who here was ready for a math test?" And most people are like, "What? We're just here to learn how to drive a forklift." Okay, well, what's the square root of 16? And most people will tell me, it's 4. And then they're like, okay, that was easy. Why? Why is the square root of 16 4? And then if you don't understand the foundation of the multiplication division used to make that so, then you have an issue. It's easy to punch numbers into a calculator, but if you don't understand the process, we have an issue. It's like, okay, so how many people learned multiplication and division? How many people learned that by memorizing the facts? Or did the teacher stop and tell you, like, well, if you have 3 times 6 and you're going to get 18 out of that, how many people understand that it's 3 groups of 6 singles, that you can break those 6 singles apart and count them up and get your answer? How many people understand that? Then how many people understand, and I'll ask these people, I'll say, well, what do you need to know before multiplication and division? And this, okay, addition and subtraction. Well, how many people understand that multiplication and division is just a faster way to add and subtract much bigger quantities? How many people understand that? And then how many people, I will ask them, I say, well, why do we add and subtract? Well, what I will say, what do you need to know before you add and subtract? And they'll say, okay, counting. Okay, so what do we need to know before counting? Your numbers, how to label your numbers. Now, this seems very simple to a lot of people and pretty absurd, but here's where it gets really interesting. Why do we label quantities? Why do we do that? It's all about organization. Why do we organize? To control. And we need to control certain things in order to do what? Maintain and improve the quality of our lives. Why is this? Why does this make sense? And why does this apply to pretty much everything that we do? because it's about maintaining and improving the quality of our lives, whether it be the purpose of going the speed limit on certain roads, whether it be using 3 points of contact when climbing up and down ladders, whether it be using a seatbelt, what's the purpose of a seatbelt, or setting out your moral foundation or your moral code with a clear goal and a transparent path of thought progression from how you're going to get from where you're at now to achieve that goal. And a lot of people don't understand to break that down. So then when you go all the way back to the self-ownership issue, people are just like, well, it's just inherent. It's like, nope, I need more than that. I want to understand. And that probably just got way off the topic, but
no problem. Yeah. So you mentioned that, that you're not satisfied with that answer, that it's self-evident, that it's natural law, that it's inherent. So I don't know if you did say, did you say what are you looking to hear? Like what is your idea that would satisfy that question, that instead of saying self-evident or natural law?
Well, natural law is something that, like I said, I was going to get into, and I'm going to actually break that down and why I disagree with the majority of what natural law is being promoted out there at another time. But natural law, and most of the time, seems to invoke something that cannot be proven or disproven. Usually, it resides on something like some spiritual thing.
Oh, right. Okay.
If anybody's going to invoke that, then basically you're invoking obedience to something that we can't prove or disprove, which then gives somebody who has a real silver tongue the ability to control the masses. And when people don't understand how to break down concepts, like I did with understanding the importance of mathematics, then it becomes a problem. Inherent, self-evident, axiomatic. I'm not satisfied with those mainly because it says an axiom would be something like it's a self-evident truth that requires no proof. Well, or a universally accepted principle. Okay, well, if it's a self-evident truth that requires no proof, why doesn't it require proof? What's the purpose? Well, the purpose ends up being something along the lines of because this God said so, or that's just the way things are. But if it ends up being something that's universally accepted, well, we own ourselves, but we don't own ourselves. How is it that if we can own ourselves, but we don't fully own ourselves because a majority of people can come in and just say, give us this money, we're going to collectively pool resources to create infrastructure and education, whether you like it or not. You don't have kids, don't care, put your money in the pot. I mean, there's so much room there, that so much inconsistency. So if I own myself, who has the right to come to me and say, you have to do this? So majority, there's no clarity in the foundation of where that comes from, which is why I like the idea that you presented, because it meshes really well with what I said, which is probably somebody's going to come up with, oh, that's some sort of logical fallacy, I'm sure. But if we can prove, if we say, okay, well, I'm responsible for all of my actions. I refine my time, my intellect, and labor for it. Okay, now we have the homesteading example. We have the homesteading method here. Okay, at least I'm not infringing upon anybody else's ability to not do this for themselves. And I'm definitely not saying somebody else has to come up and do something for me. I'm doing everything for myself. So I want that. I want everything to be perfectly clear. I don't want to leave any room open for interpretation where somebody can come in and sneak in and play linguistical ninja tricks with the way things work. And that's really what's happened with the federal government in the last 150 years since Lincoln's immoral and absolutely unnecessary war.
Yeah, yes. So one thing that you reminded me of was another way to describe voluntarism, besides the self-ownership and property rights and non-aggression. Another way was, well, don't hit and don't steal. It's a basic way to describe voluntarism. And then another even more vague way than that is to say, do what you want and accept the consequences. And I think that kind of pleasantly sums it up. And when someone says to you, like, it's natural law, it's self-evident, it's axiomatic, or somebody says, I didn't sign the non-aggression principle, the same way we say, I didn't sign the social contract or the Constitution. They say, I didn't sign the non-aggression principle, so why do I have to abide by it? And the answer is, you don't. You really don't. You do what you want, really, but accept the consequences. That's it. If your actions warrant reprisal and anger and hostility from other people, then you should accept it.
Right. And I tell people, I say, okay, well, somebody will tell me, well, I don't have to follow the non-aggression principle. I say, okay, that's fine. You don't have to follow that. But let me ask you this. Do you place value on your life?
Right.
So if you came up to me and said, I don't care about the non-aggression principle, now I'm going to ask you, do you place value on your life? Well, do you, punk? So, Mr. Danilo, do you place value on your life?
Most definitely.
Okay. Now, I have placed value on my life. I would like the value that I placed on my life respected. And I'm sure that you want the value you've placed on your life respected. Well, if you want me to respect the value you place on your life, I definitely want you to respect the value that I placed on my life. So I'm not going to do anything to infringe upon that, and I'm going to communicate with you as to the best of my ability to avoid any unnatural or unnecessary hostility between the two of us, because I don't want any conflict with you.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree that that's okay? Are you okay with that?
Yeah, definitely.
That's the non-aggression principle.
Yeah, and that's
it.
I guess another way you can put it is that it's a universalizable concept. We can't all rob each other, rape each other, kill each other, but we can all be non-aggressive toward each other.
Right. We all want to maintain and improve the quality of our lives. And people will usually say, well, what about people who want to commit suicide?
Right.
What about it? I mean, if a dog is born with 3 legs instead of 4, it's still a dog, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if a human being is born with 11 fingers, 6 fingers on one hand, 10 total, mm-hmm. They're still a human being. Well, we're logical creatures. Our main asset is our ability to think. It's our cognitive abilities. When somebody is wanting to commit suicide, they're more likely than not depressed or something. They're doing whatever is necessary that they can fathom and understand and think through clearly all the way to stop whatever pain it is. And if that pain is to commit suicide, to end it, that's the only clear path they have they can understand. So it doesn't break that philosophy. They're still trying to maintain their life or improve its quality. And by committing suicide, that's exactly what they're doing, improving its quality by stopping the pain. It doesn't make sense to us until you're afraid. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing between people coming up and it's like, well, so like my dad will say, you need to stop this anarchy crap. Stop being so idealistic. just be quiet and pay your taxes and you won't have trouble. Wait a minute. So he knows that the government has a problem, mm-hmm. but he doesn't want to stand up and address the actual issue there, which is the violence inherent in the system. It's the unspoken violence that's always the underlying violence that's always there, because if we don't obey, they pull the gun on us and take us to jail, mm-hmm. if we're lucky. And that's something that everybody wants to maintain their lives. Everybody wants that. People are going to end up abiding by the non-aggression principle regardless, unless they're in some state of duress or despair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very interesting when people say, call anarchists, utopian, idealistic, or even worse, you're a threat to society. The supreme irony is the state is calling the anarchist a threat to society.
Yeah, I got nothing for that. I really, that's something else. A lot of people get upset about all of this, and there's a lot of angry people, and I was angry for a long time about it. I learned that creation is the key. You have to create either for yourself, create connections with others to help yourself, which helps them. I mean, the key is to create, and if we don't create what we want to see in this world, and all we're going to do is be bitter about everything that we do see. Because if we don't like something, why tear it down? Create something that everybody else wants to strive for. Mm-hmm. Create something to show them, like the 3D printers. I mean, the only people who are hating the 3D printers are the people who currently have businesses vested in producing the things that are now going to be able to be easily manufactured with 3D printers. It's just going to be. I think you mentioned this the other day on one of your programs where you said something about, or maybe it was an older one, about the horse and buggy carriages and stuff like that, going striking against the automobile makers, putting up wanting laws and regulations, or maybe yours was the candle makers and the electric light bulbs and stuff like that. I don't know, but
same concept, yeah.
Right, why be afraid of this sort of stuff here? Because it's just going to improve the quality of our lives. So what? We stop working and earning a living doing whatever we're doing. The threat is not making our lives easier. The threat is always going to be those who want to tear down the things in the world that they don't like, regardless of whether they understand them or not. Those are always the threats. And it's the one thing I think all of those people have in common is they don't know how to break down concepts well enough, or are willing to look at the fact that they need to break down those concepts and understand that they need to do something different. And I think that's going to be the fundamental issue here, is just people making time to self-reflect and understand these things. But it's just easier to yell at somebody and still fear and like, damn, I'm going to make you pay for it if you don't want to. And that's not necessary.
Yeah. You just reminded me of all these different stories of conquering empires that invade foreign lands and that have slowly and meticulously developed, knowledge and books and information, and then they just go in there and just destroy everything, destroy monuments, destroy statues and buildings, and destroy libraries and books. And I think Genghis Khan did the same thing, conquering Central Asia. And just to think how much knowledge and information has been destroyed, I think from the Library of Alexandria, right? I think the Romans, right? How much information has been destroyed, how much that has set back possible progress, right? And where would we have been today if those bits of information were still with us? What would we have known? It's just, it really...
And knowledge is power. The more you know how to create, the more power you're going to have. And I just did an episode a couple of weeks ago about knowledge is power concerning that subject. And creation is always going to be superior to destruction, because at the end of the day, who's going to be beholden to who? Who's going to have to look to somebody else when there's nothing left to confiscate, when there's nothing left to consume, when there's nothing left to destroy? Who then is the master? The person or the individual who understands how to create what everybody else wants. That's always going to be the case. And when we have the ability to create, whoever is able to create and supply the demand that everybody has, that's going to change. That's going to change the name of the game for everything. And they're going to have the power. They're going to have the loyalty. They're going to have the followers, not the people who are raising the sword or the truncheon or pointing a gun. And I think too many people are quick to raise a sword instead of push a plow. It's
right.
Sometimes it's disheartening, but then there's people like you and you out there in the world, so that's very much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely appreciate what you're doing as well. And yeah, it really, like to think that there's this idea that's taught in history books, especially in government school history books, of let's say Alexander the Great. He cleared the pathways, he opened trade routes, he merged these two civilizations, he brought about trade. Look what he did. He unified this. And like we look at the Eurozone, right? They're unified. And I remember learning about Hitler, watching a documentary about him, and they were saying that if he had won World War II, and he was invading all these countries, Poland, different countries, and he had consolidated those countries and he created a huge German empire, we would be reading how he's such a wonderful thing, how he's such a wonderful person, akin to Alexander the Great. But no, he lost. Therefore, he's the enemy. And so it's the idea of this guy, this guy Dan Carlin. He makes a hardcore history podcast, and he talks about these conquerors in history, and he calls them historical arsonists, where he says there's that civilizations become decadent and desiccated and dry, and they need somebody, this one spark, this one conqueror who comes along and just adds a little spark, and it raises everything to the ground and allows for new fresh shoots of another civilization. And I don't know. I don't know if I buy that. It's
Yeah, I don't.
defending the pillage and rape and murder of millions of people because you think that their civilization is decadent. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't like that. It holds people back from raising the pinnacle of their personal and collective and social successes. I just don't. I'm not sure I like that the example.
Right.
Well, what got us out of World War II? It wasn't the fact that the government spent all this money. No, it was the fact that so much stuff was destroyed, and the jobs. The United States was already in a depression,
Hmm.
and why was there almost near 100% employment when people came back from the war in the United States? Because how many thousands of people died in that conflict?
Right.
That's why there was
Right.
near 100% employment, because there were not enough people to
Right.
fill the jobs that were left vacant because they went and picked up a rifle to
Hmm.
go shoot somebody in some faraway land that they had never met before.
Yeah.
That's why there was that. That's why people have this illusion about destroying stuff creates jobs. I mean, my God, I mean, Japan just had another earthquake or whatever it was, and if they had, I haven't heard anything recently about it, but I mean, if a city gets leveled over there, that's not going to create and change anything. It's just going to mean they're going to have to rebuild what they already had. It's a loss. It's a massive loss of real wealth that
Hmm.
would satisfy their need for sustenance and shelter and security, and just hold them back. It's not what we see; it's what we don't see.
Hmm.
And if we can't see the fact that all the what ifs all those people could create if they didn't have to recreate everything that was once there, we're just holding ourselves back. So I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that fellow's assessment. Like, just raise everything and start over.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Seems a little leftist.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
he's a very interesting historian. He does awesome podcasts, but yeah, he does have a little bit of a status bent to it. But yeah, so it is good
start
food for
somewhere,
food.
right?
Say again.
We all start somewhere, right?
Right, it's food for thought. But yeah, wonderful conversation, Jim. We will continue this again. I think for our next talk, we're thinking about talking about peace and why focusing on that and encouraging that is important. So we will looking forward to that conversation. So yeah, before we go, please plug your websites and how people can reach you if they want to follow your work.
Oh, well, thank you. I run jimlimberdavis.com. I post all of my work there. You can find me on YouTube. Just look for Jim Limber Davis. I do also a audio program, Liberty and Morality Defined Presents. You can find me on Facebook at Liberty Defined, and also at Jim Limber Davis. And then I'm also on Steemit at Jim Limber Davis, and on Twitter as well. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, just hit me up on any of those locations there. I don't serve food, so don't ask for snacks.
Food for thought. That's what we
Ah,
say. More important nourishment. But yeah, please follow his work. He's doing some great stuff. He posts on my page, adds some wonderful value. I think he does a lot of work and a lot of great work. So we gotta support each other in the especially as content creators. It's not easy. We don't make real currency off of this as much as we would like, but we do it because we have a burning, smoldering passion to spread freedom, liberty, and voluntarism throughout the land. We want to take over the world to leave you alone, right?
I don't know if I want to take over the world. I just kind of want to be left alone.
Right. Right. It's funny. But yeah, so if anybody wants to help me out, you can do so through Patreon or Bitcoin and PayPal also. Links are below. Patreon.com/peaceful-anarchism. If you to help me out, if you really find value in what I do, please support me. $1 show is all I ask. For interviewing fascinating people like Jim here, to encourage me to continue doing more of these. As you know, we all respond to incentives. We are capitalists in the end, and so free time is never really free, right? It always comes at an opportunity cost. We are sacrificing what we could have done to do this, and so monetary compensation is always appreciated and encouraged. Thanks a lot, Jim, for coming on the
Absolutely.
show. Really appreciate it. So this is Peaceful Anarchism on the Voluntary Virtues Network, and theseedsofliberty.com and theconsciousresistance.com. Wishing all of you have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye.